Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Threat Talk. I'm your host, Bob Hansmann, and today we're going to be talking about grading threat intelligence on a curve. Now, we chose that title because it had a fun play on words, but the working title was more descriptive, saying that all threat intelligence is not created equal. So the goal is to dig into some of the unspoken, or at least less talked about aspects of threat intelligence. And we're lucky today to get Druce MacFarlane to join us. He's the Senior Product Manager for Security and Analytics at Infoblox to help us do that. Thank you for joining us again, Druce.
Thank you very much for having me.
Not a problem, and really glad to have your perspective on this. Because to start out, I want to get right to the heart of that original idea that we had, which is that not all threat intelligence is created equal. Now, there's some rumors and hearsay, that, people have talked about this for years. That's why I buy product A, because I had product B, but a couple of viruses got through. So I'm switching to this other product, which might plug those holes. But, it's now starting to look like it may actually then open up other holes. There was some studies done that I'm also going to just kind of lay this foundation for the audience. There were studies done by several universities in North America, University of San Diego, MIT, and others were involved in that. And a similar study was done in Europe only about 9 months ago with a half dozen universities from the Netherlands and Germany, and they would get open source threat intelligence. They would get the threat intelligence from several vendors, and then they started comparing them. And the biggest thing that all these studies came out with was there's very little overlap between them. So you're shaking your head here. So sounds like this, of course, this is where you play. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that CISOs in general have known this for years, that no one single source of threat intelligence is going to be as good as all of them. I mean, to your point, and this isn't just this. I mean, this is kind of the lesser known secret that the industry has kind of known, and that is that you have these different sources, and there's maybe about 20% overlap between one source and another. There's obviously that core that everybody seems to know about, and everybody's got their own specialties. And I won't go into who's better at various things than others, but as a result, the people who have been in the industry for a long time understand that they need to have a really sort of biodiverse set of threat intelligence and set of security tools in order to be able to make sure that they're covering all the different holes that they may have inside their organization.
Now, I go back, for those who actually have seen this video, you can see that I've lost most of my hair, and I've been around for a while. And I recall when I got into the industry back in the mid-90s, some of the companies that I was working with, they were some of the early ones that had everything. They had email security, web security, they had endpoint security, server products. And they had a hard time selling the whole package into large corporations because the large corporations said, no, I want one vendor on my email. I want another vendor on my web gateway so that if the email gets through and somebody clicks on something, I want another vendor's threat intelligence with the opportunity to block it. And just in case that fails too, I want a third vendor on their endpoint. And so that was the way they would handle mixing different threat intelligence sources, was because your threat intelligence came as part of a product. And today now we actually have open source and other aspect or in other areas to get that kind of threat intelligence. Now that's a lot of what you work with, right?
Yeah, and to your point, you obviously you don't necessarily want the same people coming up with threat intelligence for your email as the people who are setting it up for your firewall, or as they're setting up for your IPS, or whatever different components that you end up having, because they're all going to basically reflect the same view of the world. They're not bringing anything new into the mix. So if you get somebody whose job is really to focus on the email or focus on different aspects, you're going to end up getting a much more comprehensive solution. And again, like there are, not, just like you said, not all threat intelligence is created equal. Not all threats are created equal as well. And you end up having some threats that are better served by different components inside of your threat arsenal, as well as different sets of threat intelligence. You really need that broad view of the world in order to be able to make sure that you're defending your environment as well as possible.
Now, some of this, I look at market share data quite often for different security vendors, and one of them complained that, oh yeah, 80% of financial institutions use us. And what that means is the other vendors don't have as much visibility of what's going on in financial institutions. Could that be one reason why certain vendors actually are seeing threats and able to then put those in their threat intel that others don't?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's going to be a degree of a degree of this problem that is based upon what is your point of visibility? What is what angle are you taking from the world? Like we at Infoblox have a unique perspective from a standpoint of that we have really good information from a DNS standpoint. A company that might be focused more on email is going to have a much more email-centric view of the world and be able to protect your email in potentially a much better way. So everybody's going to have a slightly different perspective, and that perspective is going to defend against different types of things. So you're absolutely right. For those people who are like, we do better in financials. Well, if all of your customers are financial organizations, that's going to be really great for being able to protect that small group of targeted attacks that might be going after those. But how effective that threat intelligence is, even when you translate that over into retail, may be completely different. So not saying that one is better or worse. It's just going to have different degrees of value in the different contexts that you're deploying it.
Yeah, and there used to be a big difference between the kinds of threats that you would see in a corporate environment versus the kind of consumer threats that you would get. But even before the whole current pandemic and work from home, most successful organizations realized that their employees had to have a blend of life, and that on the network, they would during the day be checking their personal email, and they were being exposed to consumers. So organizations, with an enterprise, we're now facing threats from, that were both consumer as well as professional business. And, we're seeing threats of all kinds that they have to deal with. So, I can understand where some vendors who actually had a huge commercial, or I should say consumer base might have been a little bit better at those kinds of threats versus the ones who are focused 100% on commercial threats. But for a company, and I'm going to just, listeners beware, I'm leading this question here. Since a company like Infoblox doesn't have a consumer product, how do we get those kinds of pieces of information to put into our threat intel that we give to customers?
So, obviously there's a great degree of, I mean, like you actually kind of touched on part of it, which was, as much as anybody would like to think that they operate inside of a particular silo, and we definitely have an operational visibility into enterprise organizations. As you mentioned, the especially in the last year, the amount of gray area that there is between consumer and commercial is kind of getting grayer. People do a lot of work from home. They do a lot of a lot of other things that aren't specifically geared toward I'm going to Google Sheets and I'm going to Salesforce.com. There's a lot of other things that end up happening just because the workplace has become a little bit less well defined. So we're having a level of visibility now in the last couple of years that we haven't necessarily had. So that helps. Having said that, we still do actively go out there and pursue as many sources as we can, but we understand that like no one organization is going to be as good at everything. So we consider ourselves part of a nutritious breakfast. We're not the entire thing. We do certain things exceptionally well, and we understand that we are going to be working with an entire ecosystem of products that are going to be able to help you protect what you're going to end up needing to protect. And we think that we complement some of those other devices very well.
Now, on the threat intelligence, pure threat intelligence side of things, one of the things I liked about Infoblox was that, because every vendor does this to some extent, but Infoblox is totally transparent about it. Your security product, there's different levels of it, and it comes with different amounts, but everyone, you list the sources of threat intelligence that comes with that package or with that offering. You're upfront that your highest package has like more than 24 different threat intelligence sources. Is that just because of the overlap, or is it because different feeds are more appropriate for different kinds of threats?
There's a lot of different reasons, and so you mentioned a couple of different things. Number one is not, as the entire title is, not all threat intelligence is created equally. There are certain categories or types of threat intelligence, and when I say types, I don't mean from a really basic level in terms of format. Like you can get threat intelligence from a standpoint of here's a list of IP addresses or here's a list of host names. And the thing with, when you think about what are the most basic types of threat intelligence that you get IP addresses, host names, domain names, URLs, file hashes, etc. Each one of those are going to have a certain, like a time to live. An IP address, for example, is very ephemeral. It's going to come online. You can block it if you want to, but that is probably going to disappear and move on pretty quickly because it's a very easy thing for you to be able to gauge. As you go through, host names are have a little bit longer of a time to live because you can shift the IP address from one to another, and the host name is still applicable. URLs, once you have a URL, that URL, if it's bad, it's going to probably stay bad, versus an IP address, which may end up being good tomorrow, or even may be good at the time when we issue it, because an IP address can be shared by a number of different hosts. So each one of these things, as I mentioned it, kind of go in terms of how ephemeral that data is, how long does it have to live, and it also, as you kind of go scrolling down that list, so you go from IP address to host name to URL to file hashes, etc. Now you're also talking about going deeper and deeper and deeper into the packet and needing to be able to extract more data in order to be able to say, yes, this thing is bad, or no, it's not. An IP address is exceptionally easy to be able to tag. Like, this thing is bad. If you have to reassemble a file so that you can create a file hash, you're going really, really deeply into the packet to be able to see what's going on. So there's very specific tools that are able to do that. And what you don't want is, you don't want to be wasting those tools that are expending a high degree of system resources to try to do what they need to do. You don't want them wasting their time with the simple stuff. So there's a whole lot of reasons why you may want to send certain types of threat intelligence to certain tools and certain types of threat intelligence to others. Part of them are, do you even want to block this at all? If it's an IP address, because of the ephemeral nature, because it has a high risk of potentially being something that's also good, it's definitely malicious. We know that this file, this IP address in this certain circumstance is malicious, but there may be other hosts that are associated with it. So there's a risk that's associated with blocking the IP address as opposed to blocking something that might be a little bit more, razor focused on exactly what the threat was. Every customer is going to have a balance of how sensitive they are to being compromised versus how sensitive they are to potentially blocking something that they may not have wanted to block. So, and every customer is a little bit unique. They have to make some of those decisions. So we slice and dice some of our threat intelligence from exactly that standpoint, that you can block this set of IP addresses, and to the greatest extent that we have made sure that they're, if you block these things, you're going to be safe, but there's a slightly higher risk to doing that because of the ephemeral nature of IP addresses. The customer needs to make that decision as to whether or not they're more worried about blocking something inadvertently or letting something go that may have been potentially malicious. So we provide the data in different formats, in different categories, for exactly that reason, so that the customer can make their own decision as to how sensitive they are to both of those potential eventualities.
Sounds like you're investing in the stock market. How sensitive are you to taking risk? Yeah. And letting something through, but hey, then we're not going to block anything that you really want to go to, unless we're really sure, but you might accidentally get to some stuff because we're trying not to impact your productivity. So that's on the one side. And the other side is like, we'll make absolutely sure you don't get to anything dangerous, but we may also block some legitimate stuff and give you some false positives along the way. That's the spectrum you're describing.
Precisely, and it is going to be very dependent on your individual organization. If you're an organization where most of your customers are consumer, you may want to err less on the side of of catching everything and more on the side of making sure that you're not blocking some website inadvertently.
Yeah, and then of course there's different departments. Maybe their use of the internet is such that, well, they aren't supposed to be using it hardly at all because they're in a huge data entry pool, and so we can lock things down more there. But over here we're talking executives and salespeople that may be doing all sorts of things, and we don't know, so we have to be less restrictive there in order for them to maintain their job. Yeah, that productivity versus security balance, that has never disappeared.
And the prime example of that would be if you go back a couple of years ago to the like the Target breach that happened on their point of sales machines. Those point of sales machines, their communication behavior should have been exceptionally deterministic. They know exactly who those things are supposed to be talking to and who they weren't. You can block IP addresses. You can block a lot more on something where you are absolutely sure that this is how these devices are supposed to behave. You can set up a lot more strict blocking rules in that circumstance than you would in a circumstance like where there's a consumer or maybe even a guest network where people could potentially be going anywhere. So a lot of it, as you mentioned, is going to depend on the environment that you're going into and how sensitive those are. Something where people are, these devices are directly dealing with credit card numbers, dealing with finances, and they have a very deterministic way of being able to communicate. Those are prime examples of where you want to be exceptionally strict in terms of what types of traffic you allow.
Yeah, and you actually were talking about devices. I want to make sure our listeners pick that nuance up, because normally in security we're used to putting on policy and rules based on users, but in this case we're talking about devices as well. So there might be somebody. Matter of fact, in my grocery store, I been shopping there for years. I know a lot of the people by first name, and they know me, and some of them are working in a back office periodically, and they're doing all sorts of stuff there as a user. But when they're on and help out because we need more checkers, and they'll come out and help at the checkouts, and on that device, their rights should be tighter. So we're talking about applying threat intelligence through more intelligent use of policies that can make a differentiation between what device the user is on, as well as which user is using the device. Now, and
another angle of this matrix as well, kind of bringing it back to how we've sliced and diced our threat intelligence, is if you think about the MITRE kill chain, you have this concept of every attack kind of goes through various different steps, from the initial just kind of doing reconnaissance, trying to figure out what they've got, all the way through this point where they actually deliver some sort of payload, you get compromised, and now you're doing internal spread, maybe some data exfiltration. So, there's, if you want to, from an overly simplistic standpoint, divide those things up into two different phases. They're the pre-breach, the things that are done that if we see it and we block it, that's great. You don't have to do anything else. There's this there's this website that we knew hosts malicious content. We blocked the user from being able to get to it, and have a nice day. There's nothing else to worry about. But then from the point of the breach onward, you've got things like command and control. You have DNS tunneling. You have data exfiltration, and all those are indicators that you have actually already been breached. And we can block that specific instance. We can block the DNS tunnel. We can block the data exfiltration, and you're still compromised. So we try to separate things also, not just from a standpoint of how risky the data is, but also into the different categories. Is this command and control? Is it data exfiltration? Is it phishing? Because each one of those is going to basically help you from a standpoint of, if I'm an incident responder, what do I need to chase down? I don't want to chase down threats that were blocked that I don't have to do anything about. Versus, here's a threat that, it's command and control. I blocked the command and control, but there's still somebody that's infected out there. I need to go out and remediate this laptop because I'm going to keep on seeing that command and control until it either gets through or we end up going through and remediate the threat. So we also do it from that standpoint too.
I was going to say, that's a big difference between your traditional web gateway, because those you typically are blocking by category, and you just have this category called malicious, but you're actually saying depending on how it's malicious may also be important, because we've been talking about blocking, and there's one more thing I want to talk about blocking, and then I want to go beyond the blocking. You actually already kind of hinted at it on the detection side, detect that you've been breached. But on the blocking side, there's also a lot of stuff that people need to block depending on their industry, government regulations, and so forth. And there are feeds for those as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've been primarily talking about threat feeds, like threat intelligence and things that are basically, we know that this thing is bad. But there's an entire category of feeds and intelligence feeds that we have that aren't necessarily pointing at something bad, but it might point at something that from a policy standpoint, you may want to be blocking as well. So one example of that are maybe embargoed countries. If you have if you're in a government organization or something where that is important, you can block communicating to websites that are hosted, for example, in Iran or one of the embargoed countries. We have the Eastern European nations.
Regardless of the TLD, even though it says .com, it may be in any country anywhere in the world. Like you said, they can move to different IP addresses.
Exactly. For some reason, the people who are actually making the threats don't really care so much about what host name or domain names that they use. They'll use whatever is actually applicable. And then so Eastern European is another one. So there's an entire set of threat intelligence, or sorry, I used the word threat, of intelligence feeds that we have. They're actually more policy oriented than they are threat oriented. These aren't necessarily bad sites. They're sites that, from a policy standpoint, you don't want your users going to.
And then, we've been talking about this. One more point I want to highlight for listeners. We've been talking about all the different feed sources that we get. Now, some of those, Infoblox actually, has its own threat research team, the Cyber Intelligence Unit, which is based out of Washington State, which is where a lot of new threat intel technology is coming out of. So I thought that was an interesting factoid. But they curate a lot of this threat. Why would they curate some of this threat intelligence rather than just, you're getting it from a trusted third party, and why not just roll it out?
Well, there's a lot of there's a lot of public domain sources, and that's going to be good. It's obviously has a certain degree of value, but it's not necessarily high value. And the reason is, like once something has become exceptionally well known, often the threat actors are going to go ahead and move on because they know that the gig is up. We've been discovered. We're going to go ahead and move out. It's the threat intelligence that we generate on our own. It's stuff that we've had to harvest ourselves. It's might come from digging through some spam or basically malicious emails that get sent around, and then we're able to extract the malicious actors, the malicious binaries, and then from there we can analyze those things and determine who are these this malicious malware, who is that actually communicating with. So it's not so much that we're curating it, and we certainly are curating it, but we're also just kind of going out there, finding it, discovering it, looking at the trends. When we saw COVID start to become a thing, we started seeing a large amount of activity of people trying to capitalize on the fact that COVID was occurring to create emails that people would be wanting to click through, or a lot of websites that came up that tried to encourage customers or users to click on things that they wouldn't normally click on because of that panic. So we go out there, we're actually generating this threat intelligence on our own, based on our own research. So there's a curation aspect as well that goes into making sure that we're not telling you to block something that's potentially good or things like. But there's a lot that goes into just going out there and doing the grunt work to try to figure out where the malicious actors are out there, and you do that through a variety of machine learning algorithms and research and just grunt work as well.
Yeah, I remember in the again back in the early days, like 10 years ago, I would get feeds from a number of public sources, and some of them, the way their filtering wasn't the best, and occasionally I'd find that they were blocking IBM.com because someone somewhere got an email from IBM They thought it was phishing, reported it as such, even though they'd actually probably, gone to a web page and checked a box that said, sure, contact me, but they didn't remember it. And so, the curation is key. So these are some of the things that help reduce the false positives. I think it was great that you highlighted that, we're still never going to get rid of all of them. And
there's a lot of, like you go into, what I was talking about earlier on with command and control. I mean, just, because the threat actors want to try to get through as much as possible, they're going to try to utilize environments that, where they know that they aren't going to be able to get blocked. And we've seen some people out there literally monitoring certain Twitter feeds, for example, looking for the command to come through from there to take whatever action that they want to do. And you can't block Twitter in that circumstance. You can be a little bit more systematic and try to block that specific account or specific calls to try to find that information. But again, like there's an entire host of stuff that we know about that's just not practical to block because it would be too disruptive in terms of how things operate, especially with things like Dropbox and Google Drive and things like that out there. You can't necessarily block everything that's malicious because a lot of those things are potentially have a lot of a higher degree of utility than they have of anything else.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are getting close to the end of time, and so we'll have you back for a part 2 because we've focused a lot on the blocking aspect. How do you get good threat feeds to stop things from getting through in the first place? But threat intelligence has an even bigger role to play to help you identify when things have gotten through and helping you just investigate. Once you've had a breach, there are a lot of questions that have to be answered, and threat intelligence plays a role there. So we'll have you back to go into what's next. So thank you very much, though, for your time today, Druce. I appreciate having you.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be here.
And thank you to all of our listeners. And join us next time as we continue our efforts to help you stay on top of cybersecurity and ahead of cyber risks on Threat Talk.